The arrow came out of the dark trees so fast that Elena barely had time to turn. She felt the wind of it brush past her cheek before it struck the wooden post beside her head. Her heart slammed against her chest. For one frozen second, the forest around the northern wall of Cross Castle went completely silent, as if it too was holding its breath. Then the second arrow came. Elena dropped low, her training taking over before her mind could catch up. She rolled across the frost-covered grass, ignoring the sharp cold biting into her palms, and came up behind a stone well, just as a third arrow struck where she had been standing a heartbeat earlier. Her breathing was fast, but her mind was clear. 7 years of being ignored by everyone in this castle had taught her one important thing. If she wanted to survive, she had to rely on herself. Voices called out from the tree line, low and urgent, speaking in a language she did not recognize. Not pack wolves, not anyone from Damien's territory, outsiders, and outsiders did not cross into the Alpha King's land unless they were either foolish or very sure of themselves. Elena pressed her back against the cold stone of the well and listened. Footsteps. 2, maybe 3 men, moving carefully through the frost, trying not to be heard. She was unarmed, except for the small silver blade she kept strapped to her ankle, a habit she had picked up after the first year of her marriage, when she had realized that no one in this castle was going to protect her simply because she wore the title of queen. She was the wife of the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, and yet she had spent 7 years walking through these halls like a ghost. The footsteps grew closer. Elena's fingers found the hilt of her blade. She would not scream. Screaming would only tell them exactly where she was. A shadow moved past the edge of the well, and Elena struck. Her blade caught the man across the forearm, not deep enough to do real damage, but enough to make him cry out and stumble back into his companion. The 2 men crashed into each other, and in that moment of confusion, Elena bolted, running low and fast toward the tree line on the other side, away from the castle, away from the men who had come to hurt her. She did not get far. A hand closed around her ankle, and she went down hard, the frost-covered ground scraping her palms raw. She twisted onto her back and kicked out with everything she had, catching the man square in the chest. He grunted but did not let go. Elena's mind raced. If she screamed now, the sound might carry to the guards posted along the outer wall. It was her only real chance. She opened her mouth to call for help. She never got the chance. A blur of gray and black fur crashed into the man holding her ankle, tearing him away with a force that sent both bodies rolling across the frozen grass. Elena scrambled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and stared as a massive wolf, larger than any she had ever seen outside of Damien himself, stood over the fallen attacker, with a low growl rumbling from deep in its chest. For 7 years, Elena had shared a castle with Damien Cross, had eaten meals at the same long table, had passed him in hallways with nothing more than a nod between them. In 7 years, he had never once come looking for her. He had never once shown concern for whether she lived or died, beyond the basic requirements of keeping his political alliance intact. And now here he was, in wolf form, standing over a man who had tried to hurt her. His fur bristled and his teeth bared, in a way that made even Elena's blood run cold. The second attacker turned and ran, disappearing into the tree line without looking back. The third, the one Elena had cut with her blade, was already gone, his footprints the only trace he had ever been there. Damien did not chase them. Instead, he turned toward Elena, his massive form shifting and blurring in the moonlight, until he stood before her as a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair damp with sweat despite the cold night air. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, rough, almost unrecognizable to her. Elena stared up at him from where she still sat on the frozen ground, too stunned to answer right away. In 7 years, she could count on one hand the number of times Damien Cross had spoken to her directly, and never, not once, had his voice carried the raw edge of worry that it did now. "I am fine," she managed finally, pushing herself to her feet without accepting the hand he offered. Old habits did not disappear simply because of one strange night. Guards. There were guards posted along this wall. Where were they? Something flickered across Damien's face, something that looked almost like guilt, though it vanished so quickly, Elena wondered if she had imagined it. "The guards were moved," he said. 2 hours ago. New orders came down from inside the castle." Elena felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air settle into her bones. Someone moved the guards away from this section of the wall on purpose. Yes. Someone inside your own castle wanted me to be found alone tonight. Damien did not answer, but his silence was answer enough. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt, standing in the dark with a man who had spent 7 years pretending she did not exist, now looking at her as though she were the only thing in the world that mattered. It did not make sense. None of it made sense. Why were you even out here? She asked. You never leave the East Wing after sundown. Everyone in this castle knows your schedule better than they know their own names. Damien's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, toward the tree line where the attackers had vanished, as though the answer to her question was somewhere out there in the dark, waiting to be found. I felt something was wrong, he said finally. I could not explain it. I simply knew. Elena wanted to laugh, but there was no humor in her anywhere. 7 years of cold silence. 7 years of being nothing more than a name on a marriage contract, and now he wanted her to believe that some invisible feeling had pulled him out of his warm study on the coldest night of the year, straight to the one place she happened to be standing. She did not believe in convenient timing. Not from a man who had never given her reason to believe in anything about him at all. I am going inside, she said, and turned to walk back toward the castle, her legs still unsteady beneath her. Elena. She stopped. He had never once, in 7 years, said her name in that tone. Not cold, not distant, not the careful politeness of a man speaking to a stranger he happened to share a roof with. There was something underneath it now, something raw and unguarded, and it frightened her more than the arrows had. What? She said, without turning around. I am glad you are safe. 4 words. After 7 years of silence, 4 simple words. And somehow they landed harder than anything else that had happened that night. Elena did not trust it. She could not afford to trust it. A man did not ignore his wife for 7 years and then suddenly begin to care because of one dangerous night. There had to be a reason. There was always a reason with men like Damien Cross, men who ruled entire territories and treated every relationship, every alliance, every marriage, as another piece on a larger board. She walked back into the castle without responding. But her mind would not stop turning over what had happened. Someone inside these walls had wanted her dead, or at least wanted her badly hurt. Someone had known the guard schedule, had known exactly when and where she would be walking that night, and had arranged for the wall to be undefended at precisely the right moment. That was not the work of outsiders alone. That required help from someone who lived inside Cross Castle, someone who had access to the guard rotations, someone who had a reason to want Elena gone. She thought of Nathan, Damien's closest advisor, who had never once looked at her without a strange, calculating expression. She thought of the whispers she sometimes heard from servants who did not realize she was close enough to listen. Whispers about how the Alpha King's marriage was a mistake, how a real queen should have been chosen from a stronger bloodline, how Elena Whitmore had never truly belonged among wolves at all. She thought of the divorce papers sitting in the drawer of her writing desk, papers she had drafted 3 weeks ago, and had been building the courage to present to Damien. Papers that, if signed, would end this cold, empty marriage and finally set her free. Perhaps someone did not want her to leave quietly. Perhaps someone wanted her gone permanently, before those papers could ever be signed. Elena reached her chambers and closed the door behind her, sliding the lock into place with hands that still trembled slightly. She crossed to her writing desk and pulled open the drawer, staring down at the folded papers inside. Divorce. Freedom. An end to 7 years of being a wife in name only. 7 years of empty chairs at empty tables. 7 years of learning to survive in a world that had never wanted her. She had been so certain, until tonight, that walking away was the only answer. Now, staring at those papers in the dim candlelight, Elena was no longer certain of anything at all. Somewhere outside her window, a wolf howled into the night, low and mournful, and Elena could not shake the feeling that it belonged to Damien, and that for the first time in 7 years, he was not simply marking his territory. He was searching for something he had lost a long time ago, without ever realizing he had lost it at all. Elena sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, listening to the fading echo of that howl, replaying every detail of the night in her mind. The way the arrows had been aimed with precision, not carelessly, but by someone trained to kill quickly and quietly. the way the guards had vanished from that exact stretch of wall at that exact hour. The way Damien's eyes had looked when he found her on the ground, wide with something she had never seen in them before, something close to fear. A king who had never once shown fear for anything did not appear out of nowhere on the coldest night of the year, unless something inside him had finally cracked. She thought about the years before this one, the quiet dinners, where he sat at the far end of the table and barely lifted his eyes to her, the meetings with visiting alphas, where he introduced her only as his queen and nothing more, the long winters, where she had learned to keep herself warm, because no one else would. She had built walls of her own over those years, walls just as strong as the ones surrounding this castle, and she had told herself, over and over, that she no longer needed anything from Damien Cross. But walls could crack too, given the right kind of pressure, and Elena was beginning to fear that tonight had cracked something in both of them. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtain aside just enough to look down at the courtyard below. A single figure stood near the edge of the training yard, still as stone, staring up toward her window, as though he had known she would be standing there. Even from this distance, even in the darkness, she recognized the shape of him instantly. 7 years of watching him from afar had taught her every line of his silhouette, whether she had wanted to learn them or not. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. Elena finally let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the arrows that had nearly ended her life that night. Whatever had shifted between them in that frozen courtyard was only the beginning, and something told her that the coming days would bring far more danger and far more truth than 7 quiet years ever had. By morning, the entire castle knew that something had happened at the northern wall, even if no one dared speak of it openly. Elena felt the eyes on her the moment she stepped into the great hall for breakfast. Servants who normally passed her without a glance now watched her from the corners of the room, whispering behind their hands the instant they thought she was not looking. She had grown used to being invisible in this castle. Being watched was a new and uncomfortable feeling. Damien was already seated at the head of the long table when she arrived, which was unusual in itself. In 7 years, Elena could not remember a single morning when he had arrived before her. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the memory of the night before hanging heavy in the space between them. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing to the chair beside him, instead of the distant seat at the far end of the table, where she had eaten every meal of her married life. Elena hesitated. Old instincts told her to take her usual seat, to keep the same careful distance that had defined their entire marriage. But something in his voice, some quiet insistence she had never heard from him before, made her pause. Slowly, she crossed the room and took the seat beside him, aware of every servant in the hall watching the small, strange moment unfold. "I have called for a meeting with Nathan this morning," Damien said, once the servants had retreated to a respectful distance. "I want to know who moved those guards." "And if you find out it was someone close to you?" Elena asked quietly. "Someone you trust?" Damien's expression darkened. "Then they will answer for it." They ate in silence after that, though it was not the same silence Elena had grown used to over the years. This silence felt heavier, filled with unspoken questions neither of them seemed ready to ask aloud. Elena found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking, trying to reconcile the cold, distant husband she had known for 7 years with the man who had shifted into a wolf and torn through the darkness to save her. It did not add up. Not yet. After breakfast, Elena retreated to the small library on the 2nd floor, the one room in the entire castle that had become truly hers over the years. It was there, an hour later, that Grace found her, breathless and pale, having clearly run the entire way from the servants' quarters. "My lady," Grace said, closing the door behind her and lowering her voice. "You need to hear this before anyone else does." Elena set down the book she had been pretending to read. Grace had been her only real friend in this castle since the earliest days of her marriage, one of the few people who had never treated her like a ghost simply because the Alpha King did. "What is it?" "There is talk among the guards," Grace said, twisting her hands together nervously, "about who ordered the change in the watch schedule last night. They are saying it came from inside the castle, from someone with real authority." "I already assumed as much," Elena said. "Do they have a name?" Grace hesitated, glancing toward the closed door as though afraid someone might be listening on the other side. Charlotte Vane. The name settled over Elena like a stone dropped into still water. Charlotte Vane was the daughter of one of Damien's oldest allies, a wolf from a powerful bloodline who had made no secret, over the years, of her belief that Elena had never truly belonged in Cross Castle. Charlotte had grown up alongside Damien, had trained beside him, had been raised with the expectation, by many in the pack, that she would one day become his mate. When the alliance marriage to Elena had been arranged instead, Charlotte had smiled through gritted teeth at the wedding, and never quite stopped circling ever since. "Are you certain?" Elena asked. "The guards would not have said it if they were not certain," Grace said. "They said Charlotte gave the order herself, claiming it came from Nathan, but Nathan has denied ever giving such instruction." Elena's mind raced. If Charlotte had truly arranged for the guards to be pulled from that section of wall, it meant she had known, or at least strongly suspected, that outsiders would be waiting there. It meant Charlotte had been willing to let harm come to Elena, perhaps even willing to see her killed, all to clear a path toward the position she believed should have been hers from the beginning. But there was something else troubling Elena even more. If Charlotte had arranged the attack from within, then the outsiders who had fired those arrows had not simply stumbled upon an unguarded stretch of wall by chance. They had been invited. Someone inside Cross Castle was working with wolves from outside the territory. Wolves willing to attempt an assassination on the Alpha King's own wife. That was not simple rivalry. That was something far more dangerous. Elena thanked Grace for the warning, and asked her to keep listening, to bring word of anything else she heard among the staff. Once Grace had slipped back out of the library, Elena sat alone for a long while, turning the pieces over in her mind, trying to decide what to do with the information she now carried. She could go to Damien directly. It was the obvious choice, the choice that made the most sense, given the seriousness of what Charlotte had apparently done. But 7 years of being overlooked had taught Elena to be careful about which battles she brought to her husband's attention, and which ones she fought quietly on her own. If she accused Charlotte without solid proof, and Charlotte's powerful family denied it, Elena would only end up looking desperate. Or worse, jealous of a woman everyone in the pack already believed should have been queen instead of her. She needed proof. Real proof. Something undeniable, before she brought this to Damien. That evening, as the castle settled into the quiet hours after dinner, Elena made her way toward the guard captain's office, hoping to find the written watch schedule from the night before, the one that would show exactly who had signed off on moving the guards away from the northern wall. She moved carefully through the halls, staying close to the shadows, aware that if Charlotte truly had allies within the castle, she could not risk being seen searching for evidence against her. The guard captain's office was empty when she arrived, the door left carelessly unlocked. Elena slipped inside and began searching through the stacks of paperwork on the desk, her fingers moving quickly through logs and rotations until she found what she was looking for. There, in careful handwriting, was the order to reassign the northern wall guards, signed not by Nathan, but by a name Elena did not recognize at all. Beneath the signature, however, was a small mark, a wax seal pressed into the corner of the page, one Elena recognized instantly. The Vane family crest. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she folded the page and tucked it into the sleeve of her dress. This was proof, real and undeniable, that Charlotte's family had been involved in reassigning the guards, even if the actual signature belonged to someone else entirely, likely a lesser member of the household acting on Charlotte's instruction. She turned to leave, and nearly collided with Nathan standing directly in the doorway. "Elena," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked briefly to the sleeve where she had hidden the page. "This is not a place I expected to find you." "I could say the same of you," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden pounding of her heart. "Were you looking for something as well?" Nathan studied her for a long moment, and Elena could not tell, from his expression alone, whether he was an ally or a threat. He had served as Damien's closest advisor for as long as Elena had lived in this castle, and yet in 7 years, she had never once been certain where his true loyalties lay. "I know about the watch schedule," Nathan said finally, lowering his voice. "I did not give that order, and I have been trying to find out who did since this morning." "I believe I already have the answer," Elena said carefully. Something shifted in Nathan's expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect. "Then you should bring it to Damien, tonight. before anyone has the chance to remove the evidence. And if Charlotte's family denies it, if they claim it was forged or misunderstood, Nathan's jaw tightened. Then you let Damien decide who to believe. He is not the same man tonight that he was a week ago, Elena. Whatever happened at that wall last night changed something in him. I have served him for many years, and I have never seen him move as quickly as he did when word reached him that you were in danger. Elena wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to understand why a man who had ignored her for 7 years would suddenly react with such urgency to protect her, but there was no time for questions now. If Charlotte had been willing to arrange one attack, there was no guarantee she would not attempt another, and Elena could not afford to wait for answers when her own safety was still very much uncertain. She made her way toward Damien's study, the folded page still tucked against her arm, her heart pounding with every step. She was about to accuse a powerful family within the pack of conspiring against her, and she had no idea how Damien would respond, or whether the fragile, unfamiliar concern he had shown her the night before would hold up under the weight of such a serious accusation. The study door was open when she arrived, and Damien stood near the tall window, staring out at the dark grounds below, much as she had done from her own window the night before. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his expression softened immediately when he saw it was her. "Elena," he said. "What is wrong?" She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, pulling the folded page from her sleeve with hands that had finally stopped trembling. Whatever happened next, whatever this revelation might change between them, she was done being someone who quietly accepted danger without a fight. "I know who moved the guards," she said, and held out the page for him to see. "And I think you need to hear everything I have learned tonight, because I do not believe last night was the last attempt on my life. I believe it was only the first." Damien crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took the page from her hands, his expression darkening as he read the name and recognized the seal pressed into the corner. When he finally looked up at her again, there was something burning behind his eyes that Elena had never seen there before, something far more dangerous than the cold indifference she had grown used to over 7 long years. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning, and do not leave anything out." Outside the study window, the wind picked up, rattling against the old glass, and somewhere far beyond the castle walls, in the shadowed hills where the Blackthorn pack made their home, a different kind of plan was already moving into motion, one that neither Elena nor Damien yet understood, and one that would soon make Charlotte Vane's quiet betrayal look like the smallest piece of a much larger and far more dangerous game. Damien listened without interrupting as Elena recounted everything, the whispers Grace had brought her, the search through the guard captain's office, the seal she had found pressed into the corner of the page. When she finished, he set the paper down on his desk with a slow, deliberate motion, as though he was forcing himself to remain calm. "Charlotte will be summoned tonight," he said, "along with her father. I want them both standing in this room before the hour is out." "And if they deny everything?" Elena asked. Her family holds significant influence within the pack. Accusing her without absolute proof could cause more damage than it repairs. "I am not interested in politics tonight," Damien said, and there was an edge to his voice that Elena had rarely heard directed at anyone but his enemies. "I am interested in the fact that someone within my own household arranged for my wife to be left undefended in the presence of armed outsiders. That is not a matter of influence. That is a matter of loyalty, and loyalty is not something I am willing to overlook, regardless of whose name is attached to the betrayal." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the distant, indifferent husband she had known for 7 years. She found none. Whatever had shifted in him the night before had not faded with the morning light. If anything, it seemed to have grown stronger, sharpened by the danger she had faced and the betrayal that had made it possible. Nathan arrived within the hour, bringing word that Charlotte and her father had been located and were being escorted to the study. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she waited, unsure of what to expect. She had spent 7 years avoiding conflict within these walls, learning to keep her head down and her opinions quiet, and now she was about to stand at the center of a confrontation that could reshape the balance of power within the entire pack. When Charlotte finally entered the study, flanked by her father and 2 guards, her expression was carefully composed, though Elena did not miss the brief flicker of alarm that crossed her face when she saw the folded page sitting on Damien's desk. "You wish to see us, my lord?" Charlotte's father asked, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to navigating difficult conversations. "I wish to know why a member of your household ordered the northern wall guards reassigned last night," Damien said, his tone flat and dangerous. "An order that left my wife undefended during an assassination attempt." Charlotte's father turned sharply toward his daughter, and for the first time, Elena saw genuine confusion in his expression. Whatever Charlotte had done, it seemed she had done it without her father's knowledge. "I know nothing of any such order," he said carefully. All eyes turned to Charlotte. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, her carefully composed expression beginning to crack at the edges. Then, finally, she lifted her chin, refusing to look away from Damien. "I only meant to test her," Charlotte said, her voice tight, "to see whether she was truly capable of standing beside you, or whether she would crumble the moment real danger appeared. I did not know outsiders would be waiting there. I swear it." "You gambled with my wife's life to satisfy your own curiosity," Damien said, his voice low and cold. "Whether or not you expected outsiders to be waiting, you left her exposed and undefended, and that alone is unforgivable." Charlotte's composure finally broke, tears welling in her eyes as she realized the severity of what she had done, and how completely it had unraveled in front of her. Her father, pale and clearly humiliated, offered no defense, only a promise that his family would accept whatever consequence Damien deemed appropriate. Elena watched the entire exchange with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. She had expected to feel triumphant, or at least relieved, seeing Charlotte's carefully built reputation crumble in front of the man she had once hoped to marry. Instead, she felt only unease, a growing certainty that Charlotte's foolish, jealous scheme had accidentally opened a door to something far more dangerous, something neither Charlotte nor her father had ever intended to unleash. The outsiders who had fired those arrows had not been working for Charlotte. They had simply taken advantage of an opportunity she had unknowingly created, and that meant somewhere beyond these castle walls, someone else had been watching, waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and they were still out there, still planning, regardless of what happened to Charlotte Vane tonight. As the guards led Charlotte and her father from the study, Damien turned to Elena, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. "This is not over," he said quietly. "Whoever sent those men across the border did not do so by chance. They knew exactly when to strike, and that means they had been watching this castle for some time, waiting for the right moment." "Then what do we do now?" Elena asked. "Now," Damien said, "I stop pretending that keeping my distance from you was ever protecting either one of us." 3 days passed without incident, and Elena almost allowed herself to believe the danger had passed. Almost. Damien had changed in ways she still could not fully explain. He no longer sat at the far end of the table during meals. He walked with her through the gardens in the evenings, saying little, but staying close enough that his presence felt less like an obligation and more like a choice. Elena remained cautious, unwilling to trust a shift that had come so suddenly after 7 years of nothing, but she could not deny that something between them had begun to change. Grace found her on the 4th morning, breathless again, though this time, her expression carried something closer to fear than urgency. "My lady, there are riders at the southern gate, Blackthorn riders." Elena's blood ran cold. The Blackthorn pack controlled the territory beyond the southern hills, a rival kingdom that had clashed with Cross Castle more than once over contested borderlands. Their alpha, Victor Sinclair, was a name Elena had heard spoken with caution, even among Damien's most confident guards. She made her way quickly to the great hall, where Damien already stood near the entrance, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the tall doors as though he could see straight through them to whoever waited outside. Nathan stood beside him, speaking in low, urgent tones. "They say they come under a banner of peace," Nathan was saying. "Victor Sinclair himself rides at the front." "Victor does not travel this far from his own territory for peace," Damien said grimly. "Open the gates, but keep every guard within reach." The doors opened, and Elena watched as a procession of riders entered the courtyard, led by a tall man with pale gray eyes and an unsettling, easy smile. Victor Sinclair dismounted with practiced grace, his gaze sweeping across the courtyard before landing, with deliberate slowness, on Elena. "Alpha Cross," Victor said, inclining his head toward Damien, though his eyes remained on Elena a moment longer than was polite. It has been too long since our last meeting. You are far from Blackthorn territory, Damien said, his voice carefully neutral. What brings you to my gates unannounced? Victor's smile widened, though it did not reach his cold gray eyes. I heard troubling news. An attack near your northern wall, was it not? Outsiders, armed and dangerous, so close to striking at your own queen. Terrible business. I came to offer my sympathies, and my assistance, should you require help hunting down those responsible. Elena felt every instinct in her body sharpen at once. Victor's concern felt rehearsed, too polished, the words of a man who already knew far more about the attack than an outsider should. She glanced at Damien and saw the same suspicion reflected in his eyes. Your concern is noted, Damien said, though I find it curious that you learned of an attack on my land so quickly, when the incident itself has not yet traveled beyond my own borders. Something flickered behind Victor's calm expression, quickly smoothed away. News travels fast among the packs, Alpha Cross. Surely you know that better than most. The tension in the courtyard stretched thin, and for a moment, Elena believed the confrontation might end there, with careful words and unspoken accusations left to simmer beneath the surface. Then Victor's gaze shifted back to her, and his smile changed into something colder, something that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. I understand congratulations may soon be in order, Victor said. Word among the packs suggests your queen has never truly been claimed. 7 years of marriage, and yet the bond remains incomplete. Such things are rarely kept secret for long, Alpha Cross, no matter how carefully guarded. The color drained from Damien's face, replaced almost instantly by a controlled fury that radiated through the courtyard like a physical force. Elena felt her own cheeks burn, humiliation and anger tangling together as she realized the true purpose of Victor's visit. This was not a courtesy call. This was a test, a deliberate probe to confirm whether the rumors circulating among the packs were true. An unclaimed mate, under the older laws still recognized by many territories, held a precarious position. If a bond remained incomplete long enough, certain ancient customs allowed for a rival alpha to challenge for her hand, particularly if her own alpha had shown no intention of ever completing the claim. It was a law rarely invoked in modern times, considered barbaric by most civilized packs. But Victor Sinclair had never been known for civility. You should leave, Damien said quietly, each word carrying a warning that needed no further explanation. Of course, Victor said smoothly, though his eyes lingered on Elena one final moment before he turned back toward his horse. I only wish to offer my concern, Alpha Cross, but do consider this a friendly reminder. The old laws still exist, whether we choose to acknowledge them or not. And there are those among the packs who believe an unclaimed queen represents an unclaimed opportunity. He mounted his horse and led his riders back through the gates without another word, leaving behind a silence so heavy that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. He knows, she said finally, once the gates had closed behind the departing riders, about us, about the marriage never being completed. Yes, Damien said grimly, and if he knows, others will know soon enough. This changes everything. That night, Elena could not sleep. She paced the length of her chambers, replaying Victor's cold smile over and over in her mind, turning his words around until they blurred together into something close to panic. She had spent 7 years wishing for freedom from a marriage that had given her nothing but loneliness. Now that same unclaimed status had become a weapon that could be used against her, a vulnerability that men like Victor Sinclair would not hesitate to exploit. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Damien standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour, his expression carrying the weight of a decision she suspected he had been wrestling with since Victor's departure. I need to explain something to you, he said. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Elena stepped aside to let him in, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and something she was not yet ready to name. He crossed to the window and stood there for a long moment, staring out at the dark grounds, before finally turning to face her. There is a reason I never completed our bond, he said quietly. It was never about you, Elena. It was never about anything you lacked, or anything I failed to feel. It was about protecting you from something I have spent my entire life trying to outrun. Then explain it to me, Elena said. Please, I have spent 7 years imagining every possible reason for your silence. and none of them were kind to either of us. Before Damien could answer, a sharp cry echoed from somewhere deep within the castle grounds, followed immediately by the sound of shattering glass and running footsteps. Damien's expression hardened instantly, his explanation forgotten in the face of sudden danger. "Stay here," he said, already moving toward the door. "I am not staying anywhere," Elena said, grabbing her blade from the desk drawer before he could argue further. "Not after everything that has happened this week." They moved together through the darkened halls, following the sound of chaos toward the eastern wing, where several guards lay wounded on the floor, and a group of armed men in unfamiliar colors were forcing their way toward the private chambers. Elena recognized the emblems stitched onto their cloaks immediately. Blackthorn colors. Victor had not left in peace after all. He had simply waited for nightfall. Damien shifted mid-stride, his body blurring into the massive form of his wolf before he even reached the intruders, crashing into the first of them with a force that sent the man sprawling across the stone floor. Elena pressed herself against the wall, blade ready, watching as chaos erupted around her. A hand seized her from behind before she could react, dragging her backward through a side corridor even as she twisted and fought against the grip. She drove her elbow back hard, connecting with something solid, and heard a grunt of pain, but the hand did not loosen. A second man appeared ahead of her, blocking the corridor, and Elena realized with a sinking certainty that this had never been a random raid. They were here for her. "The Alpha will not be pleased when he learns you resisted," the man holding her growled into her ear. "Victor only wants a conversation, nothing more." "Then Victor can come ask me himself," Elena spat, twisting hard enough to loosen his grip just slightly, enough to drive her blade back into his thigh. He howled in pain and released her, and Elena bolted down the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs, praying she was moving towards safety rather than deeper into danger. She was not fast enough. The second man caught her, before she could round the corner, his hand closing over her mouth to silence any scream, dragging her back toward a side door that led out into the night. Panic surged through her, sharp and cold, and she fought with everything she had, but his grip was iron, unyielding, dragging her steadily toward the darkness beyond the castle walls. Then, from somewhere behind them, came a sound Elena would never forget for as long as she lived. A roar, low and furious, shaking the very stones of the castle, followed by the thunder of massive paws against stone floor, closing the distance faster than anything she had ever witnessed. Damien struck the man holding her with the force of a falling tree, tearing him away from her so violently that Elena stumbled forward, gasping for breath, free at last. She turned in time to see Damien standing over the fallen intruder, his wolf form radiating a fury so intense it seemed to bend the very air around him, his teeth bared in a silent promise of violence to anyone who dared come near her again. The remaining Blackthorn men, seeing their numbers dwindling and their advantage lost, retreated quickly, dragging their wounded companions back through the shattered window and disappearing into the darkness beyond the castle walls. Damien did not chase them this time either. Instead, he shifted back into his human form and crossed the corridor in 3 long strides, pulling Elena into his arms before she even realized he had moved. She stood frozen for a moment, unaccustomed to his touch, unaccustomed to being held by a man who had spent 7 years keeping his distance from her in every possible way. Then, slowly, the shock of the night finally caught up with her, and she found herself gripping the front of his shirt, her whole body trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. "I have you," Damien murmured against her hair. "I have you. You are safe now." "They knew exactly where to find me," Elena said, her voice shaking. "This was never a raid. This was Victor, testing whether he could simply take what he wanted." "I know," Damien said, his arms tightening around her, "and I am done allowing that possibility to exist." Elena pulled back slightly, searching his face in the dim light of the hallway. Whatever walls he had built around himself over the years, whatever reasons had kept him distant for 7 long years, something had finally shattered tonight, and Elena was no longer certain she wanted those walls to be rebuilt. "You said you needed to explain something to me," she said quietly, "before all of this happened." Damien's expression grew serious, the weight of whatever truth he carried settling heavily across his features. "Yes," he said. "And after tonight, I do not think I can afford to wait any longer to tell you." Before they could leave the corridor, Nathan appeared, his clothing torn, and a shallow cut across his temple, though his expression carried more urgency than pain. Behind him, 2 guards carried a third between them, blood soaking through a bandage wrapped hastily around his shoulder. 3 of ours are wounded, Nathan reported. None dead, though it is not for lack of trying on their part. We captured one of the intruders alive before the others retreated. Bring him to the lower chamber, Damien said. I want to know everything he can tell us about Victor's plans, and I want to know it tonight. There is something else, Nathan added, lowering his voice. The window they broke through, in the eastern wing. It was not chosen at random. That corridor leads directly toward the Queen's private chambers, and very few people outside this household know the layout of that wing well enough to navigate it in darkness. Elena felt a fresh chill settle over her. You believe someone gave them a map, someone inside the castle? I believe it is possible, Nathan said grimly. Charlotte's family has already been dealt with, but that does not mean there are no other loose threads within these walls. I will begin questioning the household staff at first light. Damien's jaw tightened, and Elena could see the toll the night was taking on him. Layered exhaustion and fury, beneath the composed mask he had worn since the attack began. Do it quietly, he said. I do not want panic spreading through the household before we know exactly who we are dealing with. Nathan nodded and hurried off to oversee the wounded, leaving Damien and Elena alone once more in the flickering torchlight of the corridor. Elena studied the broken window at the far end of the hall, the frost already beginning to creep in through the shattered glass, and thought of how close she had come, twice now within the same week, to being taken from this castle entirely. You said you were done allowing that possibility to exist, she said quietly, turning back to face him. What does that mean exactly? It means I intend to complete what should have been finished 7 years ago, Damien said. Not because Victor Sinclair has forced my hand, though I will not pretend his interference has not made the danger more immediate. It means I have spent this past week finally admitting to myself something I have been denying for far too long. Elena's heart pounded, uncertain whether to hope or brace herself for disappointment. She had built her entire understanding of this marriage around the certainty that Damien felt nothing for her beyond obligation, and it was not so simple to abandon 7 years of careful, protective distance in the space of a single dangerous week. Before you say anything else, she said carefully, I need to understand why. Not the danger from Victor, not the politics of the Pax. I need to understand why you kept me at arm's length for 7 years, when every instinct you have shown me this week suggests that distance was never truly what you wanted. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as though weighing exactly how much to reveal, and how much longer he could bear to carry the weight of his silence alone. Walk with me, he said finally. There is something in my study I need to show you, something that belonged to my mother, and once you have seen it, I think you will finally understand everything I have been too afraid to say. He led her back through the quiet halls, past guards now doubling their watch along every corridor, past servants murmuring anxiously in small clusters, as word of the attack spread through the household, despite Nathan's best efforts at discretion. Elena followed in silence, her mind racing with everything that had happened, and everything that was still left unsaid between them. Whatever secret Damien had carried for 7 years, whatever fear had kept him from claiming her as his true wife, Elena finally understood that she was about to learn the truth, and that truth, once spoken, would change everything that came after it. The study was quiet when they entered. The fire burned down to glowing embers, the earlier chaos of the night feeling distant within these 4 walls. Damien crossed to a tall cabinet in the corner, and unlocked it with a small brass key he kept on a chain around his neck, a key Elena had noticed before but never questioned. Inside was a single leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with age, along with a folded letter sealed with wax that had long since cracked with time. This belonged to my mother, Damien said, carrying both items to the desk. She died when I was 12 years old. I was told for years that she died of illness, a fever that took her quickly and without warning. It was not until I became alpha myself and gained access to the private records kept only by the ruling family that I learned the truth. He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and turned it toward Elena. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though written in fear. My mother was not born into a wolf bloodline, Damien continued. She was human, claimed by my father, against the wishes of nearly everyone in the pack. Many believed the bond between them was unnatural, dangerous, a violation of the old order. There were those who wanted to see the bond broken, by any means necessary. Elena scanned the page, her eyes catching fragments of desperate, careful handwriting. Threats, whispers among the elders. A fear that grew with each passing year, recorded in careful detail, as though the author had known, even then, that she was documenting the final chapter of her own life. She was killed, Elena said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn, even before Damien confirmed it. Poisoned, Damien said, his voice tight with old, buried grief. By members of a rival bloodline who believed an unclaimed alpha would be easier to control and manipulate than one bonded permanently to a mate they considered beneath him. They believed that by removing my mother, they could reshape the pack's future according to their own ambitions. My father never recovered. He ruled for another 6 years after her death, but he was never the same man again, and when he died, I inherited not only his territory, but the fear that had haunted him every single day since he lost her. You believed the same thing would happen to me, Elena said slowly, if you claimed me. If our bond became permanent. I convinced myself that distance was protection, Damien said, that as long as our bond remained incomplete, as long as the alliance between us existed only on paper, you would never become a large enough target to draw the same kind of danger my mother faced. I told myself I was being wise, careful, responsible. I told myself this for 7 years, Elena, and I let you believe, every single day of those 7 years, that the distance was because of some failure in you, when the truth was, I was too afraid of losing you to ever allow myself to truly have you. Elena sat down slowly in the chair across from his desk, the weight of his confession settling over her in ways she had not anticipated. 7 years of loneliness, 7 years of quiet humiliation, of watching other wolves in the pack whisper about the queen who had never been properly claimed, and the reason behind all of it had never been indifference at all. It had been fear, buried so deep that Damien himself had convinced everyone around him, including her, that it did not exist. You let me believe I was not enough, she said, her voice trembling with an old hurt she had carried silently for years. You let me build an entire life around the belief that something was wrong with me, that I had failed to earn even the basic affection of my own husband, when this whole time you were protecting me from a danger I never even knew existed. I know, Damien said, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice cracked with something raw and unguarded. I know how deeply I failed you, Elena. I told myself the pain of distance was a smaller cruelty than the pain of loss, but I never once considered that forcing you to live 7 years believing yourself unwanted was its own kind of cruelty entirely. I was so consumed by my own fear that I never stopped to see how much it was costing you. Elena stared down at the worn pages of the journal, at the desperate, careful handwriting of a woman who had known she was living on borrowed time. She thought of the letter still sealed beside it, and looked up at Damien, silently asking permission before reaching for it. That letter was written to me, Damien said quietly. My mother wrote it, in the final months of her life, when she suspected what was coming. My father gave it to me, on the day I became Alpha, though I have never had the courage to open it until now. With trembling hands, Damien broke the old wax seal and unfolded the letter. He read it in silence first, his eyes moving slowly across the page, his jaw tightening with emotion he clearly fought hard to control. When he finished, he handed it to Elena without a word. The letter was short, but its message was clear, written by a mother who had understood, even in her final days, exactly what kind of man her son might become if fear was allowed to shape his future. She wrote of love as a risk worth taking, of how a life spent guarding against loss was still, in its own quiet way, a life spent losing everything that truly mattered. She begged her son, whenever he found the one meant to stand beside him, not to make her mistake of loving too late, but also not to make the opposite mistake of loving too carefully, too cautiously, until caution itself became a wall no love could ever climb over. Elena set the letter down gently, her own eyes stinging with unshed tears. 7 years of pain suddenly made a strange, tragic kind of sense, and though the hurt of those years did not simply disappear because she now understood its cause, something inside her softened toward the man sitting across from her, a man who had spent his entire adult life carrying grief and fear that had never truly belonged to him alone. Victor knows about the bond, Elena said finally. If what you feared for your mother is even partially true, then remaining unclaimed has not protected me at all. If anything, it has only made me a target in an entirely different way. I know, Damien said heavily. I have spent 7 years protecting you from a danger that never came, while leaving you exposed to a danger I never anticipated. My fear did not keep you safe, Elena. It only delayed the moment I would finally have to choose between losing you to distance or losing you to the very thing I was trying to prevent. Elena rose from her chair and walked slowly to the window, staring out at the dark grounds below, the same grounds where Damien had found her 3 nights ago, where his wolf had crashed through the darkness to save her without hesitation. She thought of Victor Sinclair's cold smile, of the old laws he had so casually invoked, of the very real danger that now stood between them and any hope of a peaceful future. I need time, she said finally, turning back to face him. Not because I do not understand your reasons, and not because I do not believe your fear was genuine. But 7 years cannot be undone in a single night, Damien. No matter how much truth is finally spoken between us, I need time to decide what I want, separate from the danger Victor represents, separate from old laws and rival packs, and everything else pressing in on us from outside these walls. Take whatever time you need, Damien said quietly. I have already taken 7 years I had no right to take from you. I will not begin pressuring you into a decision now, simply because I have finally found the courage to be honest. A sharp knock interrupted them before Elena could leave. Nathan entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim despite the late hour. The prisoner is finally talking, he said. I think you both need to hear what he has told us. Damien and Elena exchanged a glance before following Nathan down toward the lower chamber, a plain stone room used rarely, and only for matters of true urgency. The captured Blackthorn soldier sat bound to a heavy chair, a bruise darkening along his jaw, though otherwise unharmed. Fear, more than injury, seemed to have loosened his tongue. Tell them what you told me, Nathan instructed. The soldier hesitated, glancing nervously between Damien's cold expression and Elena standing quietly beside him. Victor does not simply want to weaken your alliance, he said finally. He wants the queen for himself. He believes that if he can claim her before you complete your own bond, he can invoke the old right of unclaimed challenge, and no council in the Northern Territories would be able to deny his claim, not without triggering a war neither side wants. That law has not been invoked in generations, Damien said sharply. It is barely recognized as valid any longer. Victor does not care whether it is widely recognized, the soldier said. He has spent months gathering support among smaller packs, who resent your family's influence, packs who would be glad to see the old laws restored, if it meant weakening Cross Castle's dominance in the north. He believes that once the claim is made public, enough packs will support him to make any refusal costly, if not impossible, for you to enforce. Elena felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. This was no longer a matter of jealousy or rivalry. Victor had been building toward this for months, perhaps longer, patiently waiting for the right opportunity, and the rumors of her unclaimed status had handed him exactly the excuse he needed to set his plan into motion. How soon does he intend to act? Damien asked. The soldier swallowed hard. There is a gathering of the Northern Councils in 5 days' time, at the neutral grounds near Ashwood Hollow. Victor intends to make his claim there, publicly, before witnesses from every major pack in the territory. If the Queen remains unclaimed by then, he believes the council will have no choice but to hear his challenge. 5 days. Elena's mind raced through the implications, the impossible narrowness of the window now closing around them. Whatever time she had hoped to take, whatever space she needed to reconcile 7 years of hurt with the truth she had only just learned, none of it mattered if Victor Sinclair intended to force the issue in front of every pack leader in the Northern Territories within less than a week. Damien ordered the prisoner returned to his cell and dismissed Nathan with instructions to double the watch along every wall through the night. When they were finally alone again in the corridor outside the lower chamber, he turned to Elena, his expression heavy with the weight of everything the soldier had just revealed. I told you to take whatever time you needed, he said quietly. I meant it, but I understand now that circumstances may not allow either of us the luxury of time we both deserve. I know, Elena said softly, her earlier request for space now colliding painfully with the reality closing in around them. I still need to think, Damien, but I no longer have the freedom to think slowly. She left the study without another word, making her way back through the quiet halls toward her own chambers, carrying with her the weight of everything she had just learned. Outside, beyond the castle walls, the wind continued to howl through the dark hills, carrying with it the distant, watchful presence of a rival alpha, who had no intention of waiting patiently while Elena and Damien found their way back to each other. Victor Sinclair had already shown, twice within the same week, exactly how far he was willing to go to claim what he believed should belong to him. And Elena understood, even as she closed the door to her chambers and sat alone with her thoughts long into the night. That time was the one thing neither she nor Damien could truly afford, no matter how desperately she needed it to make sense of everything that had changed between them. The days that followed passed in a strange, tense blur, each one bringing them closer to Ashwood Hollow, and the confrontation Elena knew was waiting there. She spent long hours in the library, unable to focus on any of the books she pulled from the shelves, her mind circling endlessly around everything that had happened since the night the first arrow struck the post beside her head. 7 years of careful walls, built brick by brick out of loneliness and quiet resentment, and now those walls were cracking under the weight of truths she had never expected to learn. Damien gave her the space she had asked for, though she noticed the toll it took on him. He grew quieter with each passing day, his eyes carrying a weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Twice she caught him standing outside her chamber door in the evenings, as though gathering the courage to knock, only to turn away before he ever did. On the third evening, Grace found her again in the library, this time carrying news that made Elena's stomach twist with fresh dread. "My lady, word has reached the castle. Victor Sinclair has already begun sending messengers to the other pack leaders, informing them of his intention to raise a formal challenge at Ashwood Hollow. Several packs have already agreed to attend simply out of curiosity. Others, the ones Nathan mentioned, the smaller packs who resent Cross Castle's influence, have expressed open support for Victor's claim." Elena closed the book in her lap, her hands trembling slightly. "How many packs support him?" "Enough to make this dangerous," Grace admitted. "Enough that even if the council ultimately sides with Lord Damien, the division itself could weaken the entire Northern Alliance for years to come. Some say this was never truly about you at all, my lady. Some believe Victor has wanted an excuse to challenge Cross Castle's dominance for a very long time, and your unclaimed status simply gave him the opening he needed." The weight of that realization settled heavily over Elena. She was not merely fighting for her own future any longer. Whatever happened at Ashwood Hollow would ripple outward across the entire Northern Territory, affecting hundreds of lives that had nothing to do with the personal pain and confusion tangled up in her marriage to Damien Cross. She found him later that night in the training yard, alone, moving through a series of exercises with a focus so intense it seemed almost like a form of punishment. Elena watched from the shadows for a long moment, before finally stepping into the moonlight. Damien stopped immediately when he noticed her, lowering his blade, his chest rising and falling from the exertion. "Elena." "I spoke with Grace," she said. "I know how serious this has become. This is no longer simply about the two of us." "I am aware," Damien said grimly, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "I have spent every hour since the prisoner's confession trying to find another way to protect you, and protect this territory, without forcing you into a decision you are not ready to make. And have you found one?" "No," he admitted, his voice heavy with a frustration that seemed directed entirely at himself. "There is no clean solution here, Elena. Victor has built his challenge carefully, using laws old enough that few remember them clearly, and popular enough among certain packs that dismissing them outright would only fracture the alliance further. The only way to remove his claim entirely is to remove the very foundation it stands upon. By completing the bond," Elena said quietly. "Yes." Damien's jaw tightened. "But I refuse to ask that of you simply as a political necessity. I refuse to let this become another decision made for you, rather than with you, the way our entire marriage was decided for both of us 7 years ago, before either of us had any say in the matter." Elena studied him in the moonlight, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of contradictions he carried. A powerful Alpha King, feared across the Northern Territories, and yet standing before her now, with a vulnerability she never imagined he possessed, torn between protecting his people and protecting her right to choose her own future. "Tell me honestly," she said. "If Victor Sinclair did not exist, If there was no challenge waiting at Ashwood Hollow, no old law threatening to tear apart the alliance you have spent your life protecting, would you still want to complete this bond? Damien did not hesitate. Yes, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. I have wanted it for longer than I have allowed myself to admit, Elena. I told myself for years that my distance was protecting you from danger, and perhaps in the beginning, that fear was genuine. But somewhere along the way, watching you grow stronger, watching you build an entire life for yourself within these walls, despite everything I failed to give you, the fear became something else entirely. It became a habit I did not know how to break, even after I realized how much it was costing both of us. Elena felt her chest tighten, 7 years of carefully guarded hope threatening to break loose all at once. She had spent so long convincing herself that she needed nothing from this man, that her survival within these walls depended entirely on expecting nothing from him at all. Hearing him finally say the words she had once longed for, back when she still believed there was any chance of hearing them, left her feeling raw and unsteady. I am afraid, she admitted quietly. Not of Victor, not even of the danger your mother faced, though I understand now why that fear shaped so much of what you did. I am afraid of choosing you now, only to discover that once the immediate danger passes, the distance returns, that I complete a bond born out of urgency and threat, only to find myself once again eating alone at the far end of an empty table. I cannot promise you a future free of every doubt or every mistake, Damien said. I have already proven, over 7 long years, that I am capable of terrible mistakes when fear takes hold of me. But I can promise you this. Whatever choice you make, in the coming days or in the years after, I will not disappear again. I have spent 7 years learning exactly how much that disappearance cost you, and I refuse to be the kind of man who repeats a mistake simply because the immediate danger has passed. Elena closed the distance between them slowly, stopping only a few feet away, close enough to see every line of exhaustion and hope etched across his face. That is not enough, she said softly. Words are easy, Damien. I need to know you understand exactly what you are asking, and exactly what it will require of you, not simply in this moment of crisis, but every single day afterward. Damien sank slowly to one knee before her, a gesture so unexpected that Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. This was not the posture of an alpha king, feared and respected across the northern territories. This was simply a man, stripped of every title and every wall he had built, kneeling before the woman he had wronged for 7 long years. Then let me ask properly, he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability written across every line of his face. Elena, I am not asking you to complete this bond, because Victor Sinclair has forced my hand, though I will not pretend the danger he represents is not part of what finally broke through 7 years of my own foolish fear. I am asking because I have spent this past week finally allowing myself to feel everything I spent 7 years denying, and what I feel, Elena, is not obligation, and it is not simple duty to this territory. It is you. It has always, somewhere beneath all my careful distance, been you. Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, 7 years of loneliness and hurt tangling together with something new, something fragile and cautiously hopeful, threatening to overwhelm her entirely. I am begging you, Damien continued, his voice breaking slightly on the words, not because I believe I deserve a second chance after everything I failed to give you. I am begging you, because I cannot bear the thought of losing the chance to finally be the husband I should have been from the very first day of our marriage. Let me claim you, Elena, not as a shield against Victor Sinclair, and not as a political necessity forced upon us by old laws and rival ambitions. Let me claim you because I love you, because I have loved you for longer than I ever allowed myself to admit, and because every single day I spent keeping my distance was a day I stole from both of us that I can never fully return. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the training yard, and the distant, watchful hoot of an owl somewhere beyond the castle walls. Elena stared down at the man kneeling before her, the powerful Alpha King, who had ignored her for 7 long years, now laid bare and vulnerable, in a way she never imagined possible. She thought of the divorce papers still sitting in her writing desk, the freedom she had once believed was the only answer to 7 years of loneliness. She thought of the letter from Damien's mother, of love, as a risk worth taking, despite the danger it invited. She thought of every quiet dinner, every empty chair, every whispered rumor she had endured within these walls, and weighed it all against the raw honesty now standing, kneeling, before her. "Get up," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion she could no longer contain. Damien rose slowly, his eyes searching hers, uncertain whether her words carried rejection or something else entirely. "I am not agreeing because of Victor," Elena said, reaching out to take his hand. The first time in 7 years she had chosen to touch him without hesitation or fear. "And I am not agreeing simply because you finally found the courage to kneel and speak the words I once thought I would never hear. I am agreeing because somewhere over these past terrifying, exhausting days, I have watched you become the man I always hoped you might be, buried beneath 7 years of fear and grief you carried alone for far too long." "Elena," Damien breathed, his hand tightening gently around hers. "Claim me," she said softly, "not because Ashwood Hollow is 5 days away, and not because old laws threaten to tear apart everything you have built. Claim me because we have both wasted enough years standing on opposite sides of a distance neither of us truly wanted." Damien pulled her into his arms then, and Elena allowed herself, for the first time in 7 long years, to fully lean into the embrace of the man who had once been nothing more than a stranger sharing her home. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together beneath the moonlight, the weight of 7 years slowly beginning to lift from both their shoulders. "There is still Ashwood Hollow to consider," Elena said eventually, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Even if we complete the bond tonight, Victor will not simply abandon his plans. Too many packs have already agreed to attend, expecting some kind of confrontation. Then we give them one," Damien said, a new steadiness entering his voice, the quiet confidence of a man who finally felt himself standing on solid ground, rather than the shifting sand of 7 years of denial. "Not the confrontation Victor expects, but one of our own choosing. We arrive at Ashwood Hollow together, bonded, before the council and every pack leader who agreed to witness his challenge. Let him make his claim, in front of proof that his entire argument no longer holds any weight." "He will not accept defeat easily," Elena warned. "A man who has spent months building support among the smaller packs will not simply walk away because his original justification has disappeared. Men like Victor find new justifications when the old ones fail them. Then we will be ready for whatever justification he invents," Damien said. "But I will not allow fear of what Victor might attempt next to stop me from doing what I should have done 7 years ago, simply out of caution. We have spent enough years being cautious, Elena. It cost us both more than either of us can ever fully reclaim." They returned to the castle together, and within the hour, Nathan had been summoned to begin preparations for the journey to Ashwood Hollow. Word spread quickly through the household that the Queen and her Alpha intended to complete their long-delayed bond, and Elena noticed, for the first time since her wedding day 7 years earlier, genuine warmth in the glances of the servants who passed her in the halls. Whatever quiet judgment had followed her through the castle for 7 years seemed to soften almost overnight, replaced by something that looked, cautiously, like hope. Grace found her late that night, helping her prepare for what was to come, her hands trembling slightly with an excitement she could not fully contain. "I always believed there was more beneath his silence than anyone gave him credit for," she said, fastening the clasp of Elena's cloak. "I am glad you finally found the courage to see it too, my lady." "I am still afraid," Elena admitted quietly. "Not of Damien anymore. But of everything waiting for us at Ashwood Hollow. Victor has spent months preparing for this. We have only days." "Then you will simply have to be braver than his preparation," Grace said, offering a small, encouraging smile. "You have survived worse than a council gathering these past 2 weeks, my lady. I do not doubt for a moment that you will survive this as well." Elena managed a small smile of her own, though the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily in her chest as she prepared to leave her chambers for the private ceremony that would finally, after 7 long years, make her bond to Damien complete. Whatever doubts remained, whatever fear still lingered at the edges of her heart, she found herself walking toward this moment, not out of obligation or political necessity, but out of a choice she was finally, fully, making for herself. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, Victor Sinclair continued his careful preparations for Ashwood Hollow, unaware that the very foundation of his challenge was about to crumble entirely, not out of fear or political necessity, but out of a love that had finally, after 7 long years, found the courage to speak its true name. The bond ceremony took place quietly, within the old stone chapel at the heart of Cross Castle, witnessed only by Nathan and Grace, exactly as Elena had requested. She wanted no grand celebration, no elaborate display for the pack to observe and whisper about afterward. After 7 years of her marriage existing as a matter of public record and political convenience, she wanted this moment, at least, to belong entirely to her and Damien alone. When it was finished, when the ancient words had been spoken, and the bond that had remained incomplete for 7 long years finally settled into place, Elena felt something shift deep within her, a warmth and a certainty she had never experienced before, as though a part of herself she had not realized was missing had finally been returned to her. Looking at Damien, she saw the same recognition reflected in his eyes, the same quiet wonder at a connection neither of them had fully understood until it was finally, truly theirs. There was little time to dwell in that wonder, however. Ashwood Hollow waited only 2 days away, and preparations for the journey consumed every remaining hour before their departure. The journey to Ashwood Hollow was not without its own danger. Halfway through the second day of travel, as their small escort moved through a narrow pass between 2 wooded hills, Damien suddenly reined in his horse, his body going rigid with a familiar, wary tension Elena had come to recognize. "Something is wrong," he said quietly, scanning the tree line on either side of the path. Nathan, riding just behind them, called for the escort to slow, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his blade. Elena felt the new bond hum faintly within her, a strange awareness she had not yet grown accustomed to, a thread of connection that seemed to carry Damien's tension directly into her own chest. The attack came without warning, arrows whistling down from the wooded ridge above the path, forcing the escort to scatter for cover among the rocks lining the trail. Elena's horse reared in fright, and she fought to keep her seat, guiding the frightened animal toward a cluster of boulders as chaos erupted around her. "Blackthorn colors again!" Nathan shouted, deflecting an arrow with his blade before dismounting quickly to take better cover. Damien was already moving, shifting mid-stride into his wolf form with a speed that seemed sharper, more powerful than Elena had ever witnessed before, as though the newly completed bond had strengthened something fundamental within him. He tore up the rocky slope toward the tree line with astonishing speed, and Elena watched, her heart pounding, as he crashed into the first of the hidden archers, before the man even had time to nock a second arrow. She did not remain idle. Years of quiet, careful training, the same instincts that had saved her life during that first attack near the northern wall, took over as she dismounted and pressed herself against the boulders, watching for any attacker who might slip past the chaos, toward the escort's more vulnerable flank. A man emerged from the brush, only a few strides away, and Elena struck first this time, driving the hilt of her blade hard against his temple before he could raise his weapon, dropping him instantly to the ground. The skirmish was brief but fierce, the remaining attackers retreating back into the wooded hills once it became clear that Damien's fury, sharpened by the new strength of their bond, was more than they had bargained for. When the last of them disappeared into the trees, Damien shifted back to his human form, breathing hard, a shallow cut along his shoulder, the only visible injury from the brief but violent encounter. "Victor grows desperate," Nathan said grimly, surveying the aftermath, as the escort regrouped along the narrow path. An open attack on the road to Ashwood Hollow itself. He must have learned that the bond was already completed, and hoped to prevent you both from arriving at all. Then he has only proven, once again, exactly the kind of man he truly is, Damien said, crossing quickly to Elena's side, his eyes scanning her carefully for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" "No," Elena said, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. "Though I believe Victor Sinclair should reconsider how thoroughly he underestimates me." Despite the tension of the moment, Damien's mouth curved into something close to a proud smile, brief but genuine. "I believe he is beginning to learn that lesson rather painfully." They pressed on toward Ashwood Hollow with heightened caution, the remainder of the journey passing without further incident, though the attack left no doubt in either of their minds about how far Victor Sinclair was willing to go to salvage his failing ambitions. Elena rode the final stretch of the journey with a new, quiet resolve settling over her. the fear of the ambush giving way to a steady determination to see this confrontation through to its end, whatever that end might bring. They arrived at the neutral grounds beneath a gray morning sky, the wide clearing already filling with representatives from packs across the Northern Territories, their banners fluttering in the cold wind. Elena rode beside Damien, her spine straight, her expression calm despite the nervous flutter in her chest. She had spent 7 years learning to appear unshaken in the face of quiet humiliation. She would not fail to appear equally composed now, standing at the edge of something far more consequential. Victor Sinclair arrived not long after, flanked by a considerable retinue, his expression carrying the same easy, confident smile Elena remembered from his visit to Cross Castle. That confidence flickered, however, the moment his eyes landed on Elena and Damien standing together, and the subtle but unmistakable mark of a completed bond, visible for anyone trained to recognize it. "Alpha Cross," Victor said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the surprise flickering behind his cold gray eyes. "I see you have been busy since our last meeting. You will find, Sinclair, that whatever challenge you intended to raise here today no longer holds any foundation," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "My bond with my wife is complete. The old law you intended to invoke applies only to unclaimed mates." "Elena is unclaimed no longer." Murmurs rippled through the assembled packs, and Elena watched carefully as expressions shifted among the smaller pack leaders who had aligned themselves with Victor's cause. Some looked relieved, clearly having supported Victor more out of obligation than true conviction. Others, however, wore expressions of quiet frustration, unwilling to abandon an opportunity to challenge Cross Castle's dominance simply because the original justification had disappeared. Victor's jaw tightened, but his composed mask did not fully crack. "Convenient timing, Alpha Cross. One might almost believe you completed this bond simply to avoid a challenge you knew you could not survive." "Believe whatever serves your pride," Damien said evenly. "The bond is real, witnessed and recorded according to every tradition your own council recognizes. If you wish to challenge its legitimacy, I invite you to say so before every leader gathered here today." For a long, tense moment, Victor said nothing, his eyes flicking across the assembled crowd, calculating whether enough support remained to salvage his failing plan. Elena held her breath, aware that this moment could still tip toward violence if Victor decided desperation was worth the risk. Then, from among the gathered pack leaders, an older alpha stepped forward, his weathered face carrying the authority of decades spent navigating the delicate politics of the Northern Territories. "Sinclair," he said firmly, "the law you invoked exists to protect unclaimed mates from being left vulnerable, not to serve as a weapon for ambitious alphas seeking to expand their own territory. If the bond is genuine, as it appears to be, then your challenge holds no legal foundation, and continuing to press it in front of this council would only reveal your true motives to every pack gathered here today." Elena watched the tide of the gathering shift visibly, the murmured support that had once favored Victor's cause thinning rapidly as pack leaders reconsidered their positions in light of the older alpha's blunt assessment. Victor's carefully built alliance, weeks in the making, seemed to crumble in a matter of minutes, exposed as nothing more than opportunistic ambition dressed in the language of old law. "This is not finished," Victor said finally, his voice low and dangerous, though clearly aware that the gathered council no longer stood behind him. "You may have won this confrontation, Cross, but territories shift and alliances change. I will not forget this. Nor will I forget that you sent armed men across my border and into my castle, threatening the life of my wife," Damien said, his voice hardening into something far more dangerous than the calm authority he had shown moments before. "Consider this a warning, Sinclair. Should you ever attempt something similar again, I will not extend you the courtesy of a council gathering before I respond." Victor held Damien's gaze for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing the wisdom of pushing further against an alpha whose reputation for controlled fury had just been publicly demonstrated in front of every leader in the Northern Territories. Finally, he turned without another word, mounting his horse and leading his retinue away from Ashwood Hollow, in a retreat that carried none of the confidence with which he had arrived. The gathering slowly dispersed after that, pack leaders offering cautious words of respect to Damien and Elena before departing, the tension of the morning gradually easing into something closer to relief. Elena felt the weight of the past 2 weeks finally beginning to lift from her shoulders, as they made their way back toward their own horses. The danger that had shadowed every hour since that first arrow finally, truly, behind them. "You were remarkable today," Damien said quietly, once they were riding back toward Cross Castle, the wide northern hills rolling out around them, beneath a sky slowly clearing of its earlier gray clouds. "I do not think I fully understood, until I watched you standing beside me at Ashwood Hollow, exactly how much strength you built for yourself during these 7 years I failed to notice you." "I had little choice but to build it," Elena said, though her voice carried no bitterness now, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything that path had cost, and taught her in equal measure. "Perhaps, in some strange way, those 7 years shaped me into someone capable of standing beside you today, rather than simply behind you." "I would rather you stand beside me every day from now on," Damien said, reaching over to take her hand, as their horses moved at an easy pace along the familiar road home. "Not out of necessity, and not out of danger forcing our hand, simply because it is where I want you to be." They returned to Cross Castle as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, the household staff gathering in the courtyard to welcome them home with a warmth Elena had never experienced in 7 long years of quiet, careful distance. Grace embraced her the moment she dismounted, tears of relief bright in her eyes, and even Nathan offered a rare, genuine smile as he took charge of overseeing the horses. That evening, for the first time since her wedding day, Elena sat beside Damien at the head of the long dining table, not at the distant far end where she had eaten every meal of her married life, but truly beside him, as an equal, as his wife, in every sense the word had always been meant to carry. The hall felt different somehow, warmer, filled with a quiet contentment that had never existed there before. "I never imagined I would feel at home in this castle," Elena admitted quietly, once the servants had cleared the final course and left them alone at the table. "For 7 years, this felt like a place I was simply enduring, rather than a place I truly belonged." "And now?" Damien asked, watching her carefully. Elena considered the question for a long moment, thinking of everything the past 2 weeks had revealed, the truth behind 7 years of silence, the danger that had nearly cost her everything, the fragile, hard-won trust, now settling between them like something new and precious. "Now," she said finally, "I think, for the first time since I arrived here, that this truly is my home, not because the law says so, and not because a bond ties us together according to old tradition, because I choose it, because you finally chose it too, and did not simply let it happen to both of us." Damien reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gently across her knuckles, a small gesture that carried more warmth than anything he had shown her in 7 long years combined. 7 years is a long time to lose," he said quietly. "I cannot give those years back to you, no matter how much I wish I could, but I intend to spend every year that follows, making certain you never again doubt exactly how much you are wanted within these walls." Elena smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt strange and wonderful after so many years of careful composure. Later that night, as they walked together through the quiet halls toward their chambers, she found herself thinking of Charlotte Vane, whose reckless jealousy had, in its own strange way, set this entire chain of events into motion. Charlotte's family had accepted a period of formal exile from the Pack's inner circle as consequence for her actions, though Damien had shown a measure of mercy in not demanding harsher punishment, understanding perhaps better than most how fear and desperation could drive even reasonable people toward foolish choices. "Do you think she regrets it?" Elena asked quietly. "I think she regrets being caught," Damien said honestly. "Whether she regrets the choice itself is a different question entirely, one I suspect only time will answer." Nathan met them near the entrance to the private wing, his expression carrying the last remaining traces of the day's tension. "Scouts report Victor's retinue has crossed back into Blackthorn territory," he said. "For now, at least, he appears to be retreating, rather than pressing further." "For now," Damien repeated grimly. "I do not believe a man like Victor Sinclair abandons ambition simply because a single confrontation did not favor him. We will need to remain watchful in the seasons ahead." "Then we will be watchful together," Elena said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the prospect of facing future danger beside Damien, rather than alone within her own careful walls, did not frighten her the way it once might have. 7 years of solitude had taught her how to survive on her own, This new chapter would teach her something she had never truly learned before: how to survive, and even thrive, alongside someone who had finally chosen to stand beside her, rather than at a careful, protective distance. Outside the tall windows of the dining hall, the last light of evening faded slowly into the soft darkness of night, and somewhere beyond the castle walls, the northern territories continued their quiet, watchful peace. The danger of Victor Sinclair's ambition held, for now, at bay. 7 years of silence had finally given way to a truth neither Elena nor Damien had expected to find, buried beneath old grief and older fear. And as they sat together in the warm glow of the dining hall, hands joined across a table that no longer felt like distance, but like connection, both of them understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them now, as they always should have, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as partners, bound by a choice they had both, finally, made for themselves. Winter had fully settled over the northern territories by the time the messenger arrived at Cross Castle, his horse lathered with sweat despite the biting cold, his news urgent enough that Nathan brought him directly to the private study without waiting for morning. Elena woke to the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway and rose quickly, pulling a warm robe around her shoulders as she made her way toward the study, where Damien already stood listening to the breathless messenger's report. "Speak plainly," Damien said. "What has happened?" "Blackthorn territory, my lord," the messenger said, still catching his breath. "There has been an uprising within Victor Sinclair's own pack. Several of his senior wolves, unhappy with the humiliation he suffered at Ashwood Hollow and the resources wasted on his failed ambitions, have moved against him. Victor has fled his own stronghold and is believed to be traveling north, toward the border he once tried to breach." Elena felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the study's tall windows. A cornered man, stripped of his territory and his pride, was often more dangerous than one still comfortable in his own power. "Do we know where he intends to go?" Damien asked. "There are whispers, my lord, that he means to seek refuge among smaller allied packs along the border, packs who once supported his claim at the council gathering. Some believe he may attempt to cross into your territory itself, hoping the chaos of his own pack's collapse will provide cover for one final desperate move." Damien's expression darkened, the calm authority of recent months giving way to the same protective fury Elena had witnessed twice before. Once in the courtyard the night arrows nearly struck her, and once again, on the road to Ashwood Hollow. "Then we will not wait for him to find an opening," he said. "Nathan, double the watch along every border crossing. I want to know the moment Victor Sinclair sets foot on our land." The following days passed in tense anticipation, the castle settling into a heightened watchfulness that reminded Elena uncomfortably of the weeks before Ashwood Hollow. She found herself training in the courtyard each morning, alongside the guards, refusing to be caught unprepared should Victor's desperation bring him within these walls once more. Damien, rather than discouraging her, began joining her, correcting her stance, sharing techniques honed over decades of leading his own defense, and Elena found a strange comfort in the shared effort, a partnership that felt entirely different from the quiet solitude of her earlier years in this castle. On the 5th night after the messenger's arrival, the watchtower bells rang out across the grounds, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet winter darkness. Elena was at Damien's side within moments, both of them rushing toward the eastern wall, where a small group of riders had been spotted approaching, under cover of darkness. "It is him," Nathan confirmed grimly, watching from the wall as the riders drew closer, their numbers few, their pace ragged and exhausted. "Victor Sinclair, and what remains of his most loyal followers." Rather than approaching with hidden weapons or a stealthy raid, Victor rode directly toward the main gate, his posture carrying none of the confident arrogance Elena remembered from their earlier encounters. He looked haggard, his fine clothing torn and travel-worn, the easy, cold smile entirely absent from his face. "Open the gate," Damien ordered, though every guard along the wall remained tense, weapons ready, uncertain whether this was surrender or one final desperate trick. Victor dismounted, just inside the gate, his remaining followers, no more than 6 exhausted wolves, staying close behind him. He did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he sank to his knees in the frost-covered courtyard, the same posture Damien himself had once taken before Elena, though the meaning behind it could not have been more different. I have come to surrender, Victor said, his voice hoarse and stripped of its former confidence. My own pack has turned against me. I have nowhere left to go, and no strength remaining to fight you, Alpha Cross, even if I wished to. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, any hidden blade, or desperate final gambit. She found only exhaustion, the hollow look of a man who had lost everything his ambition had once promised him. Why come here? Damien asked, his voice hard, though he made no move toward violence. Of all the territories in the north, why bring yourself to the one Alpha you have wronged most deeply? Because every other territory has already turned me away, Victor admitted bitterly. And because, whatever else you may think of me, I have heard enough of your reputation to know that you honor formal surrender, even from an enemy. I am asking for exile, not execution. Send me from these lands if you must, but do not let my own pack finish what their rebellion began. Damien was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request with the same careful consideration Elena had come to recognize in him over these past months. Finally he turned to her, a silent question passing between them through the bond that now connected them, asking for her judgment as much as offering his own. He tried to take me from you, Elena said quietly, meeting Victor's exhausted gaze without flinching. He sent armed men into our home, not once, but twice. He built an alliance meant to tear apart everything you have worked to protect. He did, Damien agreed. And yet a man on his knees, stripped of his power and his pride, poses a very different danger than a man who still believes himself untouchable. Elena considered this, the winter wind biting at her cheeks, as she studied the broken remains of the ambition that had nearly cost her everything. Mercy, she realized, was not weakness. It was, in its own way, the same kind of quiet strength she had built for herself over 7 long years of learning to survive without anyone else's protection. Exile, she said finally. Far from these borders, far from Blackthorn territory, somewhere he can never again gather the kind of influence that led him here tonight. But exile, not execution. Let him live with the consequences of his own choices, rather than dying with his ambition unresolved. Damien nodded slowly, clearly in agreement with her judgment. You will be escorted to the southern border at first light, he told Victor. You will never again set foot within Cross territory, nor within any territory allied to my rule. Should you attempt to return, the mercy shown tonight will not be extended a second time. Victor bowed his head, whatever pride remained within him finally, completely broken. I understand, he said quietly, and I will not forget this mercy, whatever else you may believe of me. As the guards led Victor and his remaining followers toward the eastern chambers to await morning, Elena found herself standing beside Damien in the quiet courtyard, the same courtyard where his wolf had once torn through the darkness to save her life. So much had changed since that first terrifying night, and yet standing here now, watching the final thread of Victor Sinclair's ambition dissolve into something manageable, something finally, truly finished, Elena felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over her. It is over, she said softly. It is, Damien agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they turned back toward the warmth of the castle. Truly over, this time. The following weeks brought a quiet the Northern Territories had not known in years, the political tension of Victor's failed ambition finally settling into an uneasy, but lasting peace. Spring arrived earlier than expected that year, the frost melting away from the castle grounds in gentle waves, and Elena found herself, more often than not, standing in the gardens beside Damien in the early mornings, watching the world slowly bloom back to life around them. She thought sometimes of the woman she had been 7 years earlier, young and frightened, arriving at Cross Castle to marry a stranger who barely acknowledged her presence. That woman could never have imagined the years of quiet loneliness that awaited her, nor the danger and truth that would eventually reshape everything she believed about her own marriage. But neither could that woman have imagined this, standing beside a husband who had finally, fully chosen her, in a castle that had slowly, surely, become a true home. You are thinking again, Damien observed one morning, watching her from across the garden path with the same quiet attentiveness he now offered her every day. I am thinking of how far we have come, Elena said, smiling as he crossed the distance between them and took her hand. 7 years of silence, and yet somehow, we found our way here. 7 years. I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for. Damien said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. Every single day, for as long as you will have me. Elena laughed softly, a sound of genuine, unguarded happiness that had once felt impossible within these castle walls. Then you had better start now, she teased, because I intend to hold you to that promise for a very long time. Later that same afternoon, Grace found them still walking together through the gardens, a small, knowing smile on her face as she approached with a folded letter in hand. Word from the southern border, my lady, she said, offering the letter to Elena. Confirmation that Victor Sinclair has settled quietly into exile, far beyond any territory allied to Cross Castle. It seems the matter is finally, truly closed. Elena read the brief confirmation and felt the last lingering knot of tension finally ease from her shoulders, a tension she realized she had been carrying, quietly, since that first arrow had struck the post beside her head so many months ago. She passed the letter to Damien, who read it in silence, before folding it carefully and tucking it away. No more looking over our shoulders, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. No more, Elena agreed. Only forward, from here. They continued their walk through the blooming gardens as the afternoon light softened into evening, Nathan overseeing preparations for a small gathering that night, a modest celebration to mark the true end of the long conflict that had once threatened to unravel everything Damien had spent his life building. Grace had spent the better part of the week arranging flowers throughout the great hall, insisting, with a stubbornness Elena had come to adore in her, that 7 years of quiet sorrow deserved to be answered with at least one evening of genuine joy. That night, surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and the easy laughter of a household finally free of fear, Elena stood beside Damien at the center of the great hall, no longer the overlooked queen who had once eaten her meals in solitary silence, but a woman fully claimed, fully chosen, and fully home. She caught Damien watching her from across the room at one point, his expression carrying none of the careful distance of their early years together, only warmth, only certainty, only the quiet promise of everything still to come. And as the spring sun rose higher over Cross Castle the following morning, warming the ancient stones that had once witnessed 7 years of careful distance and quiet heartbreak, Elena understood, with a certainty that settled deep and steady in her chest, that whatever challenges the future might still bring, she would never again face them alone. The Alpha King, who had once ignored her for 7 long years, had finally, completely, chosen to claim not just her hand, but her heart, and in doing so, had given them both the one thing 7 years of silence had nearly cost them forever, a true beginning, built not on obligation or old law, but on a love finally strong enough to outlast every fear that had once stood in its way.